Right. All right. Hey, everyone. We're going to bring it back to 5 minutes. My name is Kwong, and this is Kenneth, and we're going to be learning about React today. And React is a really powerful JavaScript library. It was actually built by Facebook to help themselves build their own websites, including Facebook.com and the Facebook mobile app. And now it's used by millions of users, millions of websites all over the internet. And as a reminder, if you have questions during the lecture, please put them in weblab.is/questions or go in the help queue and a staff member will come to you. So before we dive into React, let's go through what we've learned so far. We've learned about HTML, which is kind of like the structure of the website, the bones of the website. We have CSS, which is how you style the website, like its skin, and JavaScript, which is the functions that make your website interactive. So using the tools that we've learned, let's look at Facebook.com. This is my Facebook feed. And let's for a second pretend that you're this guy and you're trying to build Facebook.com as a Harvard student. And it's like kind of hard. There's like a ton of stuff that you have to write. So let me start out with the friends section. I'm gonna go type some divs, style that stuff with some classes, maybe do some CSS. And I have like apparently 102 friends. So I'm gonna have to write that a lot. Or 102 mutual friends. And we have all these posts on the right. So time to make more divs. I've got hundreds of posts. Like better get started writing. And I haven't even made anything interactive yet. This is like kind of getting crazy. My keyboard's like overheating. And you're like in the middle of typing your code really hard. And your dad walks in and he's like, "Are you winning, son?" But what if I told you that you could code all Facebook in just one line? You do like an opening tag, sort of like in HTML, but you see that Facebook is uppercase. And that's just the entire Facebook website. Everything's interactive and great. I mean, Facebook can't actually be like one line of code. So how's this Facebook tag actually defined? I mean, if we look into Facebook.js, it looks like there are other fake HTML tags. There's like a nav bar, friends, and feed. But this stuff doesn't exist in normal HTML. So let's dig deeper. Let's look at where each of these files are defined. If you look at navbar, it looks like there are some HTML elements. There's like div, image, but there are more of these like fake HTML tags, like separator, shortcuts, friends.js. Look in there, same thing. And we also have like a post HTML tag, but that's like not a real HTML tag. But yeah, that's like the essence of React. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's really great because of the modularity that you saw in the previous slide. You can like make these fake HTML tags and use them again and again. And it's fast and it's easy to use and well, mostly easy to use and understand. And these fake HTML tags, which I've been referring to, are actually called components. So I'll hand it over to Kenneth.
Yeah, so as Kwong was introducing React is basically just a way to organize your HTML JavaScript code. Basically, these are components, these fake HTML tags that we use the convention or React enforces the convention of capitalizing them. Yeah, so we can just code up Facebook by putting one line in Facebook. So can anyone tell me? Okay, well, so we have this website, right? We have Facebook, and this is going to be our outermost component. We have to start somewhere, right? So this is called app component. Can anyone tell me what components we can pick out within the app component that we can possibly define? No, that's okay. Well,
We can code call somewhere.
we have a nav bar on the very left, like before we have some friends, but we can put all of them together in something called info bar. And finally, we have our feed on the most right. And you can see that these are subcomponents of the app component, but we can go even deeper. And how do we go deeper? Well, within the feed, we can have posts. Within the posts, we can have post body and comment. So you can see how we sort of start with the outermost layer of our website and kind of go deeper and deeper to identify some components and subcomponents and so on. And we can write out something called a component tree structure, which is really important when you're trying to design the look of your website. So we start with the outermost app again, and we identify what components we can pick out of that. Within the feed component, we can see we have a post component, and within the post component, we can see we have a post body and a comment. So just a quick recap. Components are a reactive framework that lets you divide your website into reusable components. Each component is kind of like a custom HTML tag that's capitalized. And your app can be divided into a tree of components. But what I mean by reusable, like how are components reusable? How do you reuse the same code? So let's try to see how we can generalize a common component before seeing how to code up a reusable component. So how do you generalize comments like these? You've probably seen comments on Facebook before. Does anyone have any ideas? What kind of data can we pull out that could be, without data, what kind of information in the comment can we generalize? Well, we can generalize the comment by having a name, comment content, the number of likes, and the date posted. And these are just some of the fields we can have for a comment. There are obviously many more that Facebook probably uses, but for this lecture, we're going to use these 4 fields. So this is a visualization of the comment component that we kind of want to be able to reuse, right? If we have this one code skeleton, we can essentially just use this for all the comments we're going to code on Facebook and just plug in different data. So this comment component is basically how we're going to render all the comments on the screen, and this is just essentially a code skeleton. So how do comments contain content? How do we load data into these comments? Well, the answer is props. Props are inputs. So props are inputs passed from the parent to a child component. So the relationship that we must remember for props is that they only pass from parent to child, and that they're inputs. So you want to use the child's props. So basically, you have a parent post. In this case, we're using posts and comments as an example. So instead, you have a parent component, which is the post, and you have a child component, which is a comment. What you want to do is you want to pass the prop from the parent to the child. So some of the data that we pass in the comments, we want our name, comment content, and date posted. So the parent will pass the child those props. And then you get a rendered comment like this one. So another important thing about props is that they're immutable. Basically, you don't want to be logged into Facebook and every second your data is changing. Child components, you don't want them to be able to change props, and they can't rewrite data that the parent component passed them. So now we know how to receive data in a comment and render the data using our code skeleton. But are we done? Are we done coding with Facebook? Well, we're not done because we can't like comments. And arguably, liking comments is a big feature of Facebook comments. So when we like something, how do we store this information? How do we store the number of likes on a post or a comment? Can we store it using prop? People can give like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Can we store it using prop? No, you're right. So basically, if we store the number of likes using props, the parent component, which is the post, will pass down the same data, right? So every comment will have the same number of likes, because if we set the number of likes in the parent, basically like all the comments will have the same data. So we need something that's private to each comment. In other words, other components can't access it, and liking one component can't change the value of the number of likes of another component. So we need something that's private, and we also need something that can be changed, right? We want, when you press the button on the like button on the comment, we want the number of likes to be changed for that comment. So we want something that's private and information that can be changed. So this is answered by something called state. A state of a component is private information that's maintained by that component. So you can imagine for a comment, you can have a state called likes or num likes. And basically, when you press the like button, that will update the number of likes for that component. And it won't change the values of any other states of any component. It will just be private to that one component. So now we have our reusable comment component with all the properties that we mentioned before about the code skeleton and getting data from the parent component. And now we have a private state that tracks the number of likes for this one component. So we have successfully modularized this component and separated it from any other component comments that we won't want to change. Okay, and a quick recap is basically this is part of the tree structure that I showed you guys before. Our post component, for example, we can have all the comments as a state. And what it'll do, it'll pass down some props to a child component, which is the comment, and the comment can store its own state, which is the number of likes. And Kwong will, this is kind of hinting at what Kwong will show in a few seconds. Oh yeah, and just some properties to remember are that states should be private and mutable, and props are passed up down, parent to child, and they're immutable. Okay, now you can see.
All right, so now, now that we've learned about props and state, let's turn our attention back to building Facebook. So let's look at this post by Frida, Phineas and Ferb, and Joe for life. And let's try to break this down into some components. Let's do this exercise here. Does anyone have any ideas for how we can break this down into subcomponents? Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense. I mean, this is like a post component, and then we can break it down into comments and also replies, just as base. And let's look at the component tree for this. We have like, if you think about this post, it probably exists in like a feed which has a lot of other posts, which exists in the overall like Facebook app. And then within each of these posts, there's a lot of comments that are chosen in this post component. And then for each comment, there are a ton of replies, or there could be a ton of replies, and those could be chosen components of a comment parent component. Let me get rid of this Zoom bar. So since we just learned about props and state, let's think about what props and state could be for the post component. So the entire thing is surrounded by the red box, the happy response. Anyone have any ideas for what props and state we could use? Okay, fine. Yeah, exactly. So Leah's name is not going to change probably, and also the post content. But things like comments and the number of replies and the number of likes are going to change. So in props, we could have the parent component hand in the post component between his name and the content of this post. And then the state could be like the comments. And for now we'll use an array. And I also made a Boolean called his likes to see if we like this post or not. So let's build the next component down in the component tree, which is the comments. And let's recall that in this paradigm, the post is the parent of the comment component, and that we are constructing this comment. We're passing in the props into this comment using the post state, because in post there is the comment contents array, and that we're going to use information from that to make the comments. So again, this should be pretty similar. What could the process state be for this time for the comment component? Again, all right, it's like pretty much the same. We're going to have name the person who's doing the comments, and the content of that comment. And again, the state will be like whether or not you like that post, that comment, and you can have another array in the state storing the number of replies or the content of the replies, which we would use to make the replies component. And I've asked this like what is the class and state question before, so this time I'm just gonna hand it to you. And again, it is the name of the person giving the reply and the content. And the comment reply does not have any subtoken in our component tree the way that we define it. So we're not going to do like an array again because it's like last one, but we will have this like as a state variable. So we learned a lot about React. It's very different from HTML and CSS that you guys probably already know. So any questions so far on how React works or what we covered? Yeah, of course, like the skeleton that we're going to provide for your final project will have React, and you're free to use whatever tools you like, so for the competition. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions out loud or type them into weblab.is/questions document for yourself. Any other questions in the audience? All right, I guess we'll move on, and right now we're going to learn how to actually write a React component. So Facebook's a huge app, and remarks at the very, you can't like pull the whole thing in one lecture. So let's focus on one component for now, and we're going to focus on the replies component. So this will be like in this form. And let's take a look at the comment reply.js file, which is where we're going to define this replies component. At the top, you're going to want to import React, the library that we're using, and then also import the function useState. And this bracket notation is kind of like what we learned in the JavaScript lecture for restructuring things, which is going to take the useState function from React. You'll see more of this being used later on in the workshops. And the component itself is actually a function, a listed function, and it takes class as its parameter. And then within these curly brackets, we're going to have some JavaScript and a return statement. So the JavaScript will go on top of the return statement. So there is the state and the other JavaScript stuff. And in these parentheses, it's going to return something called JS tags, which is pretty much like HTML. So we learned about state earlier, and how do we actually use this like state in the code? It doesn't look like typical JavaScript, and just like set a variable. And that's where the useState function comes in. So this is the structure of it being used. We're going to say const, and then opening bracket, the variable name, and then the setter function. And then so that equals the useState. And false is the initial value for the state. And within these curly, or within the parentheses, in return tag, we're going to return the JSX. So JSX can be HTML elements in there. So here we're going to use div. And note that in JSX, we're not going to use class because class is a JavaScript keyword. We're going to use class name. And this is just like a weird JSX thing. And then you're going to return the content of the comment. But hold on a second, this doesn't seem right. We're, explicitly writing cleaner's name into like this h5 tag. So what can we possibly do to like change this? Anyone have some ideas? You can make a variable for the name, but since like we're passing the name as props, it already exists. So we can actually use props.name and props.content because props is an object that where props is being passed in. I haven't shown you how it's being passed in, but within this React component, props will be treated as an object, and then you can just do props.name or props.content to get that variable value. And note that here in the JSX, we're using we're using these JavaScript functions or JavaScript methods. And we're doing that by using these curly braces, which allow you to return to the JavaScript flow. It's kind of like a window backwards to the JavaScript and the rest of your component, even though you're currently in JS/HTML. And likewise, the round or the parentheses allows you to open a window into the JS apps flow while inside React JavaScript. And so we've done what we wanted to do. This component is reusable because we can pass it in class for the main content, and then it will construct this component. So now this component is reusable and it can make a ton of other comment. So before we move on, any questions on React component structure and how we write it? All right, otherwise I'll hand it off.
Awesome. Yeah, so Kwong just showed you guys how to code a React component with props. I did want to make a correction to something I said earlier. So if I go back, it's like a quick correction, but basically, the reason why we don't want to store the number of likes as a prop in the parent component and just pass it down to the child is because, as you can see, the button to like a comment is in the comment itself. So we have that in the comment component. So it's not React-like to kind of press the button in the comment component and update information that's stored in a different component. In this case, the parent component. What React does is it makes it easier to, instead of like passing a function from the parent component to the child component, and sort of updating information in the parent based on that function, you can just store state in the child component and just update based on that. You can do what I said just now, but React makes it easy by adding states. So that's the reason why we want to use a state instead of props for the number of likes. That being said, Kwong showed you guys how to make a component. I'm going to show you how to make a bunch of components from like the page you see here. So we can destructure this website as before. Remember, the outermost layer is our app. And within this app, we have, in this case, I'm going to say we have 4 different components: navbar, intro, photos, and post. And we're going to code intro, photos, and post separately and see how they kind of fit together to make Facebook as a whole. So let's start with app.js. And like Kwong said, each of these components are stored in a different file. So we're going to want to define our app component in a file called app.js. And on the right here, you can see that we have our component tree structure once again. And in this case, because we don't want to make it too complicated, we're not going to go, more than one level deep. But in your actual website, you're going to want to define more and more components that are nested or child components of components that you've defined before. So the app, in this case, is going to be the parent for navbar, intro, photos, and post. And we're not going to do anything else today. Okay, so let's start with app.js. Remember, components are just functions. So we want to define a function app, and there's nothing really to do right now. So we can just return what we want to render on the screen. And what do we want to render on the screen? Well, we can just return the HTML code, right? We can have a div, some divs, and write the tags, navbar, intro, photos, post, because that's what we want to show on the screen. And notice at the top of the screen in the code that we're importing all these files, all the functions or all the tags, basically, the React components from their files. So we have the navbar, intro, photos, and post. That's why we can use them in our HTML code here or JSX code here. So recall the definition of props. Props are just inputs passed from the child to or parent to the child component. So how do we use that in a in React itself. So basically, we have this tag, right? We have post, the post tag. Well, what if we want to have name and text as two props that we want to pass into our post? Well, we can just write a space and name equals whatever value we want to put in, and text equals, again, whatever value you want to put in. So React will automatically turn this into an object when we call it as an input. So like Kwang showed before, the comment is going to have, for example, like props as the input to the function. And what React will do, it'll turn this props into an object that has name and text as two properties. So that's why we were able to do props.name and props.text to access these properties. So in app.js, we can pass in props into intro, photos, and post by simply just putting them in the tag itself. So we have education. Right now I'm at MIT, and city. For the photos, we can pass in links. For posts, we can pass in the name and text. One thing to notice here is that, remember that when we return something in a component, we're returning JSX, and JSX is similar to HTML. So we can't just put in an array because that won't work, right? That won't, we can't just code JavaScript in JSX. So we have to enter this mini environment by putting brackets around what we want to reference in our JavaScript. So we do links equals and then brackets or curly brackets and then the array that we want to put in. But for strings, it's okay because they are like strings exist in HTML. Okay, so now that we passed in the props from our app, we can start coding up some of the components that are nested under this app. So let's start with intro. So I've coded the skeleton that we want to have for the intro. So you can see there are a couple of divs. There's like a P for paragraph, some bolded font. That's basically all the HTML that I want to render on this intro. But we are currently hard coding in the data. And this is not what we want, right? Because if we want Facebook to be able to handle a lot of users, we want all these users to have their own intros, and not all of them study at MIT, and not all of them are from Ridgefield, Connecticut. So what we want to do is we want to have this code skeleton and pass in data as props from our app component. So what do? We have props as an input to this component. And then because we passed in props from our app already, we can just simply do props.education and props.city in the HTML or in the JSX. I'll use HTML and JSX pretty interchangeably. So remember, again, we have to make a mini environment if we want to render JavaScript code in our HTML code. So we will just do curly braces and then props dot whatever property you want to access. And recall that in app.js, we're passing in education and city as two props. So we're not losing any data here. All we're doing is moving the data from whatever component that we want to generalize into our app component, which is the outermost layer. So let's code up photos.js. Photos is a bit more complicated because we have like a bunch of files and we want to be able to make HTML tags out of them. So let's code it without props first. So as you can see, we have just an array of all the photos I want to pass in. And then you guys learned about the map function pretty briefly this morning, but essentially what this is doing is mapping all of these photo links and creating HTML tags, image, and then like the source is the photo link. And this stores it in a new array, which is my image tags. Not too important to understand what this is doing. It's just showing what the power you can use with JavaScript. And then once we have my image tags, it's all the image tags that we want to render on our component. So we can simply return and then some HTML and have curly braces around my image tags to just kind of paste all the image image tags into the HTML that we want to render. All right, so we can replace all of this with props. And as you can see, if we replace it with props, the code becomes very small. And this is a good thing because we don't want a lot of lines of code and complicated code. So again, we have props as an input to this function. And then for my image tag, we can simply do props.links because we passed in the links as a prop. And then we can do the same thing as we did before. And once again, in app.js, we're not losing any data. We're simply passing in links as a prop that we can now call in photos. All right, and lastly, let's try to code up post.js. So again, we start with the kind of the data and the HTML that we want to render. So remember that Kwong mentioned that we can't use class in JSX code or React's HTML code because it's reserved keyword for CSS. So we have to use class name. So we have to use class name and say that we define a class called post, not too important. And then we pass in the data that we want. Here we have a button element, and basically it's rendering the like icon, which is a thumbs up, and then 250 hard coded in. So this is just representing what is on the left side of the screen. And again, our data is hard coded in, which is not ideal. So what can we do? We can pass in the data as props. And as you can see, the props that I have are a name and text. So props is an input once again, and props.name, props.text, we can just simply replace with curly braces and props.property. But we have one problem here, right? What do we do about this 250, right? We said that we want to use a state with it, but how do we code up a state? And we can't just do like props dot whatever because it's not a prop, right? Yeah, so once again, num likes, which is the variable we're going to call it. We want to store it in the component and we want it to be private and also changeable. So we want to use state. All right, so this is a syntax for a state, and it gets a bit more complicated because instead of just importing React, we also need to import useState from the React package. We also need to define this special syntax that you guys will get very good at by the end of WebLab. Basically, just remember this, const, and we have an array. NumLikes is the name of the state we want to have. And setNumLikes is the callback function that will allow us to change that state. And then useState is just saying that we want to make this a state. And in the parentheses, we have what state we want to initialize, or what value we want to initialize the state to. So what this line is doing is it's defining two things. It's defining NumLikes to be 0 at first, which is a state. And it's defining the function setNumLikes such that when we call setNumLikes of parentheses of something in that function, it sets the state to that value. So that's what this line is doing. And then button becomes a bit more complicated. I'll breeze a little bit through it now, just to like go through all the code first. So for button, we're gonna just set the number of likes to number of likes plus 1. And then down here, we're gonna do curly braces num likes to, instead of hard code the 250, we're gonna render it as the actual number of likes. All right, so I promised I'd talk a little bit more about the button. So onClick is something that we can use in HTML. Yeah, so Kong is writing onClick. So in React, we don't want to conflict with code that we can write in HTML because this is technically not HTML. It's React's version of HTML, but it's something called JSX, which is short for JavaScript XML. And this is a very HTML-like language, but it's like React's version of it. So we can't just simply do onClick lowercase. We're gonna have to do onClick like with a C uppercase. And usually the convention for React is that things are camel case. So like the first word is lowercase, or the first letter is lowercase, and then all the words after that are capitalized. Yeah, so onClick is the callback function for the button. And what we want to define onClick, we want to define onClick as the callback function to set the number of likes to num likes plus 1. So it's a pretty complicated syntax, but essentially what we're doing is we're saying when we click the button, we want to call this function, right? And this function is a callback function which calls set num likes to num likes plus 1. Pretty complicated. We can't just do set num likes plus 1. We need this extra function because it has to be a callback function. If you're confused about callback functions, you can ask us questions, or you can go back to the JavaScript lecture earlier today. All right, so we have all the components that we coded up. We have navbar, intro, photos, and posts. Oh, we didn't code up navbar, but not important today. You'll do that tomorrow, I think. And then one important thing to note, it seems magical, right? We're just doing props.property, but we're not losing any data because we define all the data in app.js, which is the outermost layer. So we're not losing data, we're just making code more reusable and making our components into skeletons for other data. Yeah, so you guys might be confused right now, but you'll be very fluent in React soon. Yeah.
So we've learned a lot today about React, and it's very different from the HTML and JavaScript that we are familiar with. So let's take a quick recap into what we've learned so far. We can divide our app into components and put each component in its own file, its own JavaScript file. And each component is a function that will pass in the props as an input, and it returns JSX, which again stands for JavaScript markup language, which is basically like HTML, but with a little bit extra features, and you can use React components as well. The parentheses allows us to enter into a JSX environment while you're inside React JavaScript. So it's kind of like a portal into JSX. And the other way around is to use curly braces when you're inside JSX. And that allows us to bring a portal back into the JavaScript in the React component. Any questions about this kind of thing? I know it's very different from what we learned earlier with HTML. Yeah, so it's kind of like And now let's talk about actually writing these components. We pass in the props with the name of the component, which is always uppercase in React, unlike HTML. And then you pass in props as though they were HTML element attributes, but now they're called props. And they're accessible as a function input with the prop parameter, and it's an object that you can destructure it or do prop attached together with class. And again, React state variables are different from if you just did const or let inside the React component. We're going to talk more about the difference tomorrow, but state is the only memory of a React component other than props, we just turn it to it. And we use this in past const, opening bracket, the value, the setter, and then equals state, and then the initial value for that state. Oh. Okay. And again, React uses class name instead of class because it is JSX. And again, things like onClick is slightly different than with normal HTML, where it's all over the place. It is in camel case. So that's it for our React lecture, but you might go home and be like, oh, let me start writing some React components and put that in the JavaScript file. So that's not exactly going to work yet. We use like Node and other things that actually run this stuff, run this React and change it into normal JavaScript and HTML for the browser. But that's it for React today. We learned a lot, so if you want a recap into what we learned, you can go to weblab.is/React Guide, which is kind of some notes for what we've learned today. I'm just gonna show you guys this to kind of drive home how it's like cool. And you should use this while building your website. And every day we actually send out class notes. So that should be posted on Piazza and this will be in that.
Do you guys have any questions? All right. Yeah, so ask your questions to weblab.is/questions. Do you have any? You also go to.
And apparently these are all companies that were using React a few years ago, and now other people are using React, so React's really cool. And I guess now we're going to hand it off to Lena, who will talk about that we learned about yesterday. But we'll have a few minutes of break before that happens.